Alright, this screencast is going to be talking about some of the new weapons and technology during World War I. Depending where we left off in your particular class, you may be able to fast forward through some of this. So, for the most part, there's not a whole lot of action in the war until a few years in, mainly the second and third year. And we're going to kind of see some of the weapons that were being developed before the war and then in time for the war to actually get rolling here. For the first weapon I'm going to introduce, it's going to be machine guns. Machine guns were very much a defensive style weapon, as you really couldn't move around easily with it, but rather you kind of had it mounted, set up on the ground, and you waited for someone to come towards you before defending yourself and attacking them with the gun. We've come a long way since the original machine gun that you see in the picture, but they were very common during World War I, with Germany having and using the most of this weapon during the war. The second type of weapon that was kind of invented in time for the war were tanks. Tanks were able to kind of provide a means of transportation that you were protected by, because you could ride in the tank and move into enemy territory where you would probably be fired on, but you were protected inside of the shell of the tank. They were kind of unreliable at first, being kind of large and slow moving, but we've come a long way with this invention as well. The Allies, or the Triple Entente, were far more successful at producing tanks than Germany was for this war. As you see those statistics on the screen, you don't have to know those specific numbers at all, but just know that the Allies used them more effectively during World War I. So we see airplanes being used kind of in warfare for the first time during World War I. We see the planes are still kind of our old classic style of planes. They're not they're not very modern planes, but it's the first time we're going to see it as a modern weapon. They first used planes, both sides would use planes to kind of fly over into enemy territory to gather intelligence about maybe how many weapons they had and how many people were in a certain area and your enemy's location. But eventually they would start actually using the planes as fighter planes by mounting machine guns on the planes themselves, where they would then fly into enemy territory and meet other enemy planes, and there'd be an attack in the sky. One of the most successful fighter pilots has the nickname the Red Baron. He is a German fighter pilot. His name is actually written on the screen, Manfred von Richthofen. You don't have to know the German name. I'd rather you know the well-known nickname, the Red Baron. But he is probably the most successful of the German fighter pilots, and he won several dozen battles in the sky, successfully shooting down enemy planes. So even though he's not on our side and he's part of the Triple Alliance, it's still he's still an important pilot in history, being so successful. The other type of aircraft that was used during World War I were called Zeppelins. Zeppelins probably are more well known as blimps, which is why the picture looks like a blimp, and yes, that is why Red Zeppelin Pizza, which is really good, but it has a red blimp as its logo on the front of the sign, because it is a Red Zeppelin. They were used to kind of gather military intelligence as well as in bombing raids. They would lead large bombing raids, and Germany primarily uses the Zeppelin. They're actually the ones who developed it. The country that gets bombed the most is, of course, England, and specifically London. The UK is isolated as an island. They're on the water, and so they can't really easily be invaded by land, so instead they were always bombing raids on England and on London and on the UK as a whole. It's how they're primarily attacked by the Triple Alliance throughout the war. That happens in a lot of movies as well. You see scenes of bombing raids in movies like Narnia and Peter Pan. All right, another style weapon that we see for the first time are submarines. Germany is also the first to use these. It's the first time submarines are being used as weapons. Germany is very successful at launching surprise attacks on ships from submarine boatcraft. We don't have, anything like sonar yet, so there was no way for anyone to detect that the submarines were in the surrounding area. But they are Germany's going to call their submarines U-boats. So the German submarines will be called U-boats. Okay. This is also going to be the thing that brings the U.S. into the war, how Germany uses their ships, and we'll talk about that in a later part of the chapter. Gas warfare. This is kind of one of the more horrific inventions at the time, once again developed by the Germans, but eventually all sides will use it. Gas warfare was extremely effective because there really, was no need for gas masks yet, because it was the first time gas was being used as a weapon. And so there's really no way for, the Allies or the Triple Entente, those who were being victimized by the gas warfare, to protect themselves at first, because they had no need for the mask in the beginning. Okay, it just has to be invented at this point. The different types of gas that were used were chlorine and mustard gas. Now, chlorine was pretty much uncontrolled once it was released, and in heavy amounts, it can be lethal to inhale. It's a very strong kind of gas, okay? So the whole premise for Germany was they wanted to release the chlorine gas and kind of stun their enemy. If they would inhale the chlorine, they would kind of be caught off guard, disabled a little bit, a little disoriented, and then that would be easy for them to be attacked by the Germans. The mustard gas worked a little differently because it was actually a blistering agent that would kind of burn your skin if you came into contact with it. It would form blisters on your skin, also used, as I said, to stun your enemy. And then the last of the weapons we'll discuss were flamethrowers. The flamethrowers are going to be, sorry about that, someone just walked in, I don't even know who it was. A student, maybe?
Yeah, I was a student.
Want to take a video or something, maybe? Okay, so flamethrowers are essentially used to flush your enemy out of hiding. If people were hiding in, as we'll discuss, the trenches, then this would be a way to start a fire and force your enemies to expose themselves, so not just relying on the hiding game. They're first used in World War I. We'll see them a lot more active at a later time, but this is the first war we see them in. Okay, let's now talk about, and this will be kind of what we wrap up with for the purpose of the notes, trench warfare. So we have all these defensive style weapons. So now we need a defensive style of fighting in order to be able to use those weapons, okay, effectively. And that style of fighting is going to be called trench warfare. I'm going to be very much willing to show y'all kind of diagrams in class on Monday if any of this is confusing, so just try to bear with me on that. And just try to write down the notes the best you can and try to process visually what I'm saying. First off, consider a trench like a ditch, a very, very deep ditch, one that you could like walk through, walk in between different rows, and still remain underground. Because if the ditch itself is dug and it's 8 feet plus deep, then if you stand on the ground level, or in the trench, you're not going to be exposed on the ground level. Above, you wouldn't be above the land. You'd still be deep in the earth. This is where the waiting game comes in. Essentially, both sides of this war, the Allies and the Central Powers, are going to have a system of trenches running parallel to each other where they hide from their enemy in the trench, waiting for them to expose themselves and attack somewhere in the middle. So imagine you have like one trench on the left side, one trench on the right side. You're in your trench on the left looking over towards the enemy's trench while they're in their trench looking towards you. So you're looking towards the middle. You're looking at each other, essentially. And there's a large stretch of land in between the two of you on ground level. Okay? You're hidden when you're in the trench. If you were to pop out and start walking towards enemy trenches, you're exposed and they can attack you. So it's a very dangerous kind of situation. Trenches are mainly constructed in France during World War I as two long parallel systems of deep, deep ditches where you could walk underground. Okay? You don't have to know these terms, frontline, support, and reserves that you see on the screen. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of trenches were dug throughout France. Conditions in the trenches were very, very poor because of the weather. It is extremely cold, very damp, very wet, and diseases would spread easily in that environment, and people did not keep their feet dry and warm, and this is where we get the condition called trench foot, where if your foot is exposed to freezing temperatures, unsanitary, conditions, and damp, wet conditions for a long enough period, you would get serious, serious infections on your foot, potentially leading to the need for amputation. Throughout France, trenches could be built different lengths apart. Some trenches, like you and your enemy's trench, could be separated by only like 70 yards of land, but some people would have a full mile or even several miles of land in between there and their enemy's trench, so a larger stretch of land in the middle. But what you often had, and just so we know, the region of land in between the trenches is called no man's land. So no man's land is referred to as the land in between you and your enemy's trench. No man wants to be there because it's very, very dangerous, obviously. A lot of times you'd have impediments kind of in the middle of no man's land where trying to prevent you from making it to your enemy's trench or trying to stop you. What we see a lot of is a lot of barbed wire, trapping uniforms, trapping men as they're trying to sneak across no man's land at night into their enemy's territory to launch an attack. I mean, that's the thing, y'all. These trenches and the trench warfare system, it creates this large waiting game. You're in your trench, your enemy's in their trench. You're all looking at each other, but no one wants to make a move because it's obviously extremely dangerous to launch an attack when you know what type of weapons are waiting for you on the other side. So a very, very scary environment for these soldiers, and really the meaning behind, we're down in the trenches, we're fighting, that figure of speech refers to being in the middle of it, really being in the center of working hard and trying to persevere. We'll talk about some examples of specific battles in which trench warfare is very hard for both sides of this war, and we're also going to watch a video in class on Monday. So please write down any questions you have, particularly about trench warfare. I'll be happy to draw some diagrams if necessary. Hope you all have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday.